I've kind of mentioned on this podcast. I think, people have sort of gotten to know me to some degree as a host and know that I've said multiple times that I'm a very agreeable person, excessively so, to the point where I often will like avoid confrontation. I'm uncomfortable even like disagreeing with people or pushing back on something. So for whatever that's worth, that's kind of my qualifier coming into this. But what I want to bring up is the idea that sometimes people need medication. And I know that, you state that in both of these books, and I'm not convinced that that's true. And I want to hear you make the case for that. And I'll just say, that I think that that is somewhat equivalent to saying some people need alcohol. And if we imagine a thought experiment where alcohol was the drug developed in psychiatry that started being used and it became common practice, I think that had that been the case, some people might today be saying, well, some people do need alcohol. And I just think that I see their utility, and I don't think I'm ready to say that there's no place for them, but I'm not convinced that anyone needs them. Again, I believe they're useful, but anyway, go on.
I think that's a fair point. I'm not sure I would actually disagree with what you just said. I think where I'm coming from is that I also see quite a few patients who carry some shame around being on medication, or get the message that that there's something wrong with them to be using it, or that it's bad or that it's going to harm them. And I think where I land is somewhere in the middle, maybe probably more towards the end of the spectrum that you're describing, where I think that people can live well without medication. And also, given our current state of treatment and knowledge and available resources, I do think that it gives people relief at times, and I think that's worthy. I believe I see this all the time, that people can get better more quickly, and just in terms of pure symptom relief.
Sure.
And I don't personally have a problem with that. My concern is a little more what I was saying before, that once the problem is resolved, if it's not a clearly recurring illness, I think the medication should be withdrawn before it's been on board for so long that that becomes a very difficult thing to do.
Right. Well, that makes sense. And I want to acknowledge that in all of my criticism of modern psychiatric practices, when it's kind of the extreme opposite, not what you're describing, but the very quick diagnosis and prescription and giving people the impression that they need to be on this for the rest of their life, and that whole common practice, I'm a fierce critic of that. I think that's doing tremendous harm. And I and in all my criticism, I think it's important that I acknowledge I'm not working as a clinician with the most extreme cases of psychosis and depression and panic attacks and things like that. I mean, I do have field experience and I work in the prison system. And so I see some extreme cases of various mental conditions. But, just to be fair, I understand that whether you are the physician or the family member of a person who is extremely disturbed in some way, I completely understand the desperation there. And I agree that it's a problem that if we put a sense of shame on people for taking any kind of pill, there should be no shame. And everyone's just trying to feel better or support their loved ones. And I respect that completely. And I just think we have to be very honest about what the treatment really is. And it's not like a cure for an illness. It's just like a psychoactive substance that makes you feel better. And that's useful. And I'm not against biological interventions. I think there's tremendous value in intervening on the biological level. And if that's with a psychoactive substance and it's truly helpful, then I support that, as long as we're being very honest about the nature of the treatment. And as you're saying, as long as we are being proactive about preventing this from becoming a dependency. Well, yeah, I'll let you respond if you'd like to any of that.
Well, one of the things that I did when writing the chemistry of calm was to try to dig into the history of psychiatric medications. And it was very informative for me, because throughout history, there have been various substances that have been discovered and thought to be a panacea, basically. Alcohol was one of those at one time. And some other, what we think of as psychoactive street drugs were at one time, really considered to be that. And then, of course, there was the Valium type drugs, the benzodiazepines, and even before that, phenobarbital. And, there's just been this recurring theme of finding an external solution, thinking that it's just going to be the greatest and that there's no problems with it, and prescribing it, to huge numbers of people. And then after a few years, sometimes it's a couple of decades or more, finding out that in fact, these drugs we thought were totally safe, always universally helpful, they're not those things, and that they create a sense of dependence. And I think that I don't know how long, but maybe another generation or so, I think we'll look back at the current medications and see them in much the same way.